Right, so Keir Starmer's middle name might be Rodney, but it really ought to be corruption this week. The word must run through him like a stick of rock, and he's ably proving it right now with not just one scandal involving a disgusting ultimatum, which carries with it enormous consequences for each and every one of us, not just those who have supported him or his party, or at least those capable of individual thought if they carry through the logical conclusion of Starmer's actions here, and might be feeling a little bit uncomfortable about it. And certainly those of us critical of Starmer are looking at this and thinking, well, it is par for the course for this petty factional control freak. But this isn't even the only massive corruption scandal Starmer, as unpopular as he is in the country already, has brought down on his head. Because he's now trying to save an MP who has just been convicted, in order to avoid a by-election he would almost certainly lose. Taken together, Keir Starmer's government is to be one where what he says goes, and where convicted felons can stay as MPs when they're his sort of people. He was a lawyer once upon a time, wasn't he? Right, so it's a tale of two corruption scandals for Keir Starmer this week, one of which has blown wide open just this morning, the authoritarian control freak now literally threatening democracy itself, and especially within his own party. It concerns the 7 Labour MPs who were suspended for voting for an SNP amendment to the King's speech to demand the end of the 2-child benefit cap, daring to vote to take children out of poverty. What the temerity of them. Something Starmer said he would actually do before pulling his usual trick of just changing his mind later on when he'd milked all the positivity out of it. So all these MPs did was actually hold him to a previous position, not to mention what is good and just and right in the world, but rather than lift kids out of poverty, they can't work, I suppose. They can't provide growth to the economy, presumably the thinking. It's all Labour obsess over, while failing to deliver any at all. These 7 MPs ended up getting suspended for a period of 6 months for their rebellion, at which time this would be reviewed based on their conduct in the meantime. This is what we were told. In other words, vote how you're told to if you want to come back in. Well, 6 months expired on the 23rd of this month, and thus far we'd heard very little about any of the 7 being readmitted to the party. The 7 MPs in question, if you have forgotten by this point, being John McDonnell, Imran Hussain, Zarif Sultana, Afsana Begum, Ian Byrne, Rebecca Long-Bailey and Richard Bergen. Now, there was some chatter the other day that 5 of the 7 were being prepped for return, the 2 being left out being Zara Sultana and Afsana Begum, allegedly. Wonderful optics of 2 non-white Muslim women being singled out there, wasn't there? But things have shifted all the more now, it seems. Apparently all 7 have been having one-on-one meetings with the Chief Whip, Alan Campbell, in what frankly sounds like a nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition affair. With the way Starmer operates these days, you could imagine thumbscrews or the rack being involved, but no, I'm sure things didn't actually go that far. The ethos of these meetings is essentially to make each of these MPs aware that their readmission is dependent on their good behaviour. Well, what could you possibly mean by that? Well, voting is you're damn well told, clearly. The Guardian, who have gleefully carried this story this morning, have cited a Labour source, anonymous as ever. What are you scared of? Your constituents finding out what you really like? Saying each was going to be judged on their own merit, as several had over the last few weeks been making matters worse for themselves. Well, really? A few examples have been given of what making matters worse for yourself actually looks like too. You see, 3 of the 7 who are not expected to get the whip back quite yet for their continued errant behaviour, apparently, are Zara Sultana, John McDonnell and Richard Bergen in particular. So what could they have possibly done then? Well, Sultana has a pinned tweet on her Twitter profile, it's been there a while, asking Starmer to end the government's complicity in Israel's genocide in Gaza by ending all arms sales to Israel. Well, how dare she ask such a thing? Richard Bergen has continued to criticise government policy via social media as well, and McDonnell was of course the other day brought in for questioning under police caution for having dared to take part in a flower-laying ceremony to dead Gazan children as part of the more celebratory pro-Palestine march of the other weekend when the ceasefire there was announced. That's their crimes. That, though, the Guardian also claims all 3 are agitators in the same sentence, given their ongoing opposition to arms sales to Israel, to keeping kids in poverty and opposing the scrapping of the winter fuel allowance. Well, really, how dare they? What are they thinking? What kind of monsters are they? What is actually happening here is these 7 MPs are being told you can only come back in if you just stop rebelling. Another source, anonymous again, said they can't come back and behave themselves for 2 months and then start rebelling again because, well, that's not how it's done, is it? But what misses the point here is that these 7 have ultimately been punished for representing their constituents. They put their constituents before party, country before party, what is right and just before party, and Starmer punished them for it. And essentially all of this comes across as a message to vote as you're told, sod your constituents, sod how depraved I am and what I'm telling you to do. You agree to this or you aren't coming back into the Labour Party. Who do you think you are? Representatives of the people? Who ever thought of such a notion? Well, when Starmer says jump, you go how high? Have you got it now? When Starmer says my Labour, my government, he really does mean it, doesn't he? Because he's a petty control freak who throws his toys out of the pram. If you dare oppose his repeatedly unpopular policies, it is corruption, plain and simple, therefore, isn't it? And it's a message to members of the Labour Party and people beyond that voting Labour, backing that party, isn't a vote to get more say, it's a vote to get less. And when you consider the massive majority Starmer actually has, having a handful of rebels like this makes no real difference to getting things through. So why be so heavy-handed? Why be so petty? Why create such negative headlines when it's all completely avoidable? And it can only speak to how much Starmer truly hates the left, hates dissent, how much of a control freak he is, that he's prepared to, as unpopular as he already is, to become even more so out of sheer petulance. Aside from petulance, though, perhaps fear is a significant element here as well, though, which brings me on to the other story, which has gone far less publicised. That of trying to now keep an MP convicted of assault in his post. Yes, voting against child poverty gets you suspended, but a convicted felon on the right of the party, well, Starmer will apparently try his damnedest to protect you and keep you in post. And again, it speaks to the lack of necessity of it all. With that large majority, you don't need to protect one dodgy MP who's going to trigger a by-election, perhaps. But it's the fear of losing that by-election, as Starmer almost certainly would, that is driving his insanity now. And for a guy who was traded on his reputation as a lawmaker, his background in law, as Director of Public Prosecutions, as a KC, to try and protect an MP convicted of assault, who is awaiting sentencing, well, it's no wonder the mainstream media aren't covering it. The optics are absolutely rancid, appallingly damaging for Starmer, the establishment's man as he is, though, trashing that reputation of being righteous to one just as corrupt as the worst of politicians. The MP in question here is Mike Amesbury, of course, as you might well recall, the MP for Runcorn and Helsby, who has been convicted of assault in a late-night brawl in the street in Frodsham, in his constituency, last October. Now, as I said, Amesbury is awaiting sentencing right now, and figuring that it is entirely possible he could be sentenced to more than a year in prison for his crime, Labour were considering a backup option to replace him. Certainly, there's an argument that where MPs are supposed to hold themselves to the highest possible standard, that Keir Starmer said his Labour candidates going to the last general election were of the highest quality. Amesbury has shown that to be just another lie as well, hasn't he? That making an example of Amesbury in law, therefore, would be a not inappropriate response in sentencing. Not learning anything from upsetting local members by not letting them pick their own candidate again, though, the plan to replace Amesbury, as was, allegedly involved parachuting in Labour's biggest loser, Jonathan Ashworth, into the seat. But now so obvious has it become that any by-election they put Ashworth up in, Labour are going to lose. Frankly, anybody they put up, Labour are going to lose it. That they're now attempting to keep Amesbury in post come what may. Hoping to God he now gets less than a year in jail at worst. And you wonder, given Starmer's legal connections, if pressure could be being applied on that matter. Possibly, perhaps. Amesbury's sentence, when it comes, will be an interesting one, especially if it is particularly light. But now Starmer and Co are looking at opposing a vote of parliamentary suspension for Amesbury of more than 10 days, because that, of course, would trigger a recall petition. So if they can keep that from happening, that would prevent a recall petition being triggered in his constituency, which Labour would almost certainly lose, and therefore a by-election would automatically get triggered. It doesn't matter if he gets sent down and Runcorn and Helsby are left without representation for however long it seems. All that matters is Starmer not losing a by-election, which ultimately won't put a dent in his majority anyway. Starmer would rather try and manage bad optics, and these are as bad as you get, than lose. He would rather keep a felon as an MP than lose that seat, and all whilst keeping other MPs suspended if they don't vote how he wants them to, given what they rebelled over at that. If you were still convinced Starmer is an utterly corrupt and craven and an absolute monster, hopefully you'll start to think again now, because I cannot see how anyone can defend this and not look like a complete mug doing it. Of course, the kind of thing these MPs who serve constituents before party will be expected to defend to keep the whip, if they get it back shortly, will be Rachel Reeves' slash and burn approach to benefits. An appalling slur coming from her last weekend in relation to sickness benefits and disability support, showing what she really thinks of an entire demographic she doesn't see as helping her growth obsession, despite many of them using the additional support they get to access work. Insulting and pig ignorant. Get all the details of that story in this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe before you do those so as to ensure you don't miss out on new daily content, and it'll help support the channel as well, which is very much appreciated. And I will hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers folks.